Have you ever paused to think really deeply about who you are? Beyond just the labels you wear or the roles you play day to day. It's a question that seems simple on the surface, right? But it gets incredibly complex fast. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some, really insightful research. It explores how our identity, that internal picture we build of ourselves, actually aligns with something even deeper, our innate drive for growth, our fundamental self. And for those of you maybe studying to guide young minds, perhaps thinking about elementary education, what we're about to unpack here has really profound implications for nurturing the developing identities of your students.
That's exactly right. Our main source for this dive, it's some groundbreaking research from the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research, and it focuses specifically on self-determination theory, or SDT. And it offers this distinct and pretty powerful framework. It helps us understand why some identities seem to lead to much greater well-being than others. It really zeroes in on this core idea that we have an innate, so almost like an internal compass, you could say, that's always driving us toward growth.
Okay, let's try and unpack this a bit because it feels like a bit of a mind bender. In everyday talk, we often use self and identity almost interchangeably, don't we? Like, I'm finding myself, or, oh, that's just part of my identity. But SDT, our source material, it says these are actually quite distinct. So what's the core difference? And I guess, why does it really matter?
It's a really critical distinction, especially within SDT. You're right. In a lot of the prevailing identity literature, self and identity often get treated as synonyms.
Yeah.
But SDT sets them apart quite clearly. Think of the self. Think of it as an innate, natural, sort of ongoing process, a basic growth tendency that continuously guides individuals toward a more integrated and optimal functioning. So it's not like a static thing you just find, but more this dynamic, unfolding inclination towards growth and, higher levels of organization.
Ah, okay. So it's less about what you are at any given moment and more about the process of becoming, like an internal GPS always kind of nudging us forward.
Precisely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, identity, on the other hand, that's the internal self-structure representing who one believes one is.
Right.
It's that set of characteristics, values, aspirations, and representations people use to define themselves. And here's the crucial point. Your identity, who you believe you are, it may or may not actually be congruent with this underlying self and its natural growth tendencies. This difference, it actually taps into a long-standing debate, in the broader identity world about whether identity development is mainly about discovery or construction. SDT leans more towards discovery, uncovering that authentic drive for growth. But it clarifies that this drive isn't some predetermined thing. It's a natural inclination that then shapes countless forms of identity through interaction with the world around us.
Wow, okay. That's a huge shift in perspective. So if I'm getting this right, it's not like there's a fixed identity just waiting under a rock somewhere to be found, but more like an inherent drive to grow. And your identity kind of forms around that drive, or sometimes maybe even against it if you're not careful.
You've absolutely got it. And for those of you thinking about working with children, maybe in a classroom setting, imagine a child's natural curiosity, their eagerness to learn something new that's their self in action, right? Their innate growth tendency. They're driven to explore, to master things, to connect with others. Now, their identity might start forming around labels like, I'm good at math, or I like drawing, or maybe I'm the quiet one. The key question then for their well-being, for their development becomes, how well do those identities they're starting to form actually align with that innate drive for exploration, mastery, and connection?
Mm-hmm.
Are they discovering who they authentically are, or are they maybe constructing a self-belief that could be at odds with their true growth?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. If the self is this innate growth tendency, this engine for development, what gives it the energy? What fuels it so it can flourish? Our sources point to three basic psychological needs that fuel this whole process. Think of them like the essential nutrients for our inner growth.
That's absolutely foundational in SDT. The theory spells out 3 innate, universal psychological needs. These provide the necessary energy for that integrative process of the self we were talking about. When these needs are satisfied, people will flourish. They show signs of healthy adaptive functioning. But when they're thwarted, people become vulnerable to less optimal adjustment or even psychological distress in severe cases. These are really non-negotiables for healthy development.
Okay, lay them on us. What are they?
All right, the first one is competence. This is the need to feel effective, to feel capable in realizing and obtaining desired outcomes. Think about that sheer joy a child gets when they finally tie their own shoes, or they figure out a tough math problem. That's competence right there, that wonderful feeling of, hey, I can do this.
Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. You feel good when you achieve something. What's next?
The second is autonomy. Now, this is the need to experience a sense of volition, psychological freedom in one's actions. It's not really about being totally independent or just doing whatever you want. It's about feeling like your actions are genuinely chosen, that they reflect your authentic self, rather than feeling pressured or, coerced. So a child who chooses to read a book they're actually interested in is exercising autonomy, and that choice itself is inherently motivating.
And the third essential nutrient.
Relatedness. This is the need to feel connected with other people, to feel genuinely accepted in interpersonal relationships. It's about belonging, really. Feeling valued and cared for within a community, whether that's family, friends, or, a classroom. Feeling connected is just vital.
So, thinking like someone preparing to teach, I'm already picturing how even giving students small choices in the classroom could be, transformative. It's not just about giving up control, is it? It's about what that psychological freedom actually unlocks for them. So, okay, let's imagine we're designing a classroom. How do we consciously weave these three vital needs, competence, autonomy, relatedness, into the actual fabric of the learning environment?
That's an excellent question, and it's really where SDT becomes incredibly practical for educators. Let's take autonomy in the classroom. Give students genuine choices whenever possible. It could be as simple as choosing which book to read during quiet reading time, or maybe how they want to approach a creative project, or even where they prefer to sit for a focused activity. Like you said, it's not just about control. It's about fostering that crucial sense of psychological freedom, that volition in their learning. It helps them feel truly invested.
Building that ownership, yeah.
Exactly. Then, for competence in the classroom, your role is crucial in providing challenges that are, just right. Not so easy, they get bored. Not so hard, they get frustrated and give up. Offer constructive feedback that focuses on their effort and the process, not just the outcome. Celebrate effort. Celebrate those small wins. And scaffold learning, break it down so students feel capable of achieving. When a child masters a new skill because you've guided them appropriately, that feeling of competence is deeply satisfying. It builds their belief in themselves.
Makes sense. And the last one? Relatedness.
Right, relatedness in the classroom. Here, you want to foster a genuine sense of community. Encourage collaborative work where students actually learn to value each other's contributions. Create opportunities for students to feel valued by their peers and, this is critical, by you, their teacher. Simple things like morning meetings, group projects, maybe even a system for peer tutoring can build strong connections. It makes the classroom feel like a safe, accepting place where students feel they belong. And when students feel seen, connected, safe, their learning just flourishes.
Okay, so if our identity isn't always perfectly aligned with our true self, our growth tendency, what actually drives the choices we make about who we are? Our sources break this down into the why and the what. Let's start with the why, the sort of underlying motives behind our identity choices.
Right. This is where we get into what SDT calls the continuum of internalization. Basically, individuals have different motives for exploring identity options and committing to them. And these motives fall along a spectrum, from highly controlled to fully autonomous. At the far end of controlled regulation is external regulation. This is when behavior is driven purely by external pressures like seeking rewards or avoiding punishment. The value of that identity choice isn't internalized at all. So, for instance, an adolescent might research law studies simply because it brings approval from their parents, who always wanted them to be a lawyer. They're doing it because they feel they have to, not because they want to.
Like just ticking a box, basically.
Precisely. Moving a bit up the continuum, but still in that controlled zone, is introjected regulation. Here, the value is sort of taken in, but it's not fully accepted as one's own. It's driven by internal pressures, things like guilt, shame, maybe even boosting fragile pride. This tends to create inner conflict and often leads to rigid, kind of obsessive adherence. So a high school student might explore different study options just to avoid feeling guilty later about making the wrong choice, or maybe to prove something to themselves. The commitment feels like it's inside the person, it becomes part of their identity in a way. But it's not truly congruent with their authentic self because it comes with that nagging internal pressure that should.
That's a fascinating nuance. So just because a motive feels internal doesn't automatically mean it's truly free or healthy.
Yeah.
I can definitely think of times, where I thought I was choosing something for myself, but looking back, maybe it was more about avoiding what others might think. How
Yeah.
do we even help someone recognize that introjected pressure, especially kids?
That's a crucial point, and it really highlights why understanding these distinctions is so important. Okay, now we move into the more autonomous forms of regulation. The first is identification. Here, people genuinely identify with the value of a commitment or choice because they truly understand its personal relevance. They feel volitional, like it's their choice. A high school student might explore study options because they genuinely believe it's truly important to be well-informed before making such a big life decision. They've accepted the value as their own, not because of pressure, but because it resonates with them personally.
Ah, okay. That's a significant shift, isn't it? From avoiding guilt to genuinely valuing the process itself.
Exactly. And then at the highest, most autonomous level, we have integrated regulation. This involves bringing together various personal values and identity-relevant commitments in a meaningful manner, aligning them with other values they endorse as part of themselves. This requires a high level of reflection, self-awareness. A lack of this integration can lead to what SDT calls fragmentation. For example, someone that might hold a very individualistic, competitive attitude at work, but also a very compassionate, caring attitude toward their family. If these feel totally separate, compartmentalized, rather than expressions of a deeper, coherent value system, that shows a lack of integration. When you're operating from integrated regulation, the different parts of your identity feel coherent, authentic, aligned with your deepest self. And the research is clear. Autonomous motives consistently lead to greater need satisfaction, better well-being, and overall adjustment. Controlled motives, on the other hand, are linked to feelings of pressure and alienation.
That's so important for teachers, for anyone working with kids, to grasp. Let's bring it back to the classroom. Imagine a child doing a class project. How would these different motivations actually play out?
Great question. Let's walk through it. If it's external regulation, the child does the project only because they'll lose recess if they don't, or maybe just to get that sticker on the chart, their own internal drive, not really engaged. With interjected regulation, they might do it to avoid feeling bad about themselves if they don't do well, or maybe to impress you, the teacher, and get your approval. There's an internal pressure, yes, but it's still not genuine enthusiasm. Now, if they're operating from identification, they understand the project's personal value for their learning. Maybe they see it as good practice for writing skills they genuinely want to improve, or they're learning about a topic they find personally interesting. They identify with the purpose. And finally, with integrated regulation, they complete the project because it aligns with their broader sense of self, maybe as a curious person, a responsible learner, someone who values contributing to the class community. It fits seamlessly into who they aspire to be. So yeah, the why fundamentally changes not just whether the project gets finished, but the child's whole internal experience of learning and their developing sense of who they are.
Okay, so beyond why we commit to an identity, what we commit to also matters deeply. Our sources highlight two types of goals, right, that underpin our identity choices, and they seem to have really different outcomes for our well-being.
That's absolutely right. The content of our identity goals, what we actually aspire to become or achieve, can be broadly categorized as either intrinsic or extrinsic. And this makes a huge difference in how congruent our identity feels with our true self, and crucially, whether our basic psychological needs get met along the way. So, intrinsic goals. These focus on things like community contribution, self-development, and affiliation. Things like personal growth, building meaningful relationships, helping others. They reflect what SDT calls a being orientation, a focus on actualizing one's personal interests, values, and potential. These goals are called intrinsic because pursuing them is more likely to lead the person directly to experiences that satisfy those inherent psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. For instance, a high school student might choose medical studies because they genuinely want to make a difference for children in underdeveloped countries. Their identity is built around this deeply meaningful, internally satisfying goal.
That sounds like a really powerful, deeply personal driver. What's the alternative then?
The alternative is extrinsic goals. These focus on external rewards, things like financial success, social recognition, and physical appeal. Getting praise, looking good, having wealth or status, they involve more of a having orientation, a focus on acquiring external markers of worth. These goals are considered extrinsic because pursuing them often drives people away from opportunities to satisfy those basic psychological needs. Take that same high school student choosing medical studies, but this time maybe the primary driver is to become financially successful and gain a certain social standing. The path might look similar, but the underlying motivation, the what, is fundamentally different.
So how does chasing extrinsic goals actually undermine our core needs? I mean, if you actually achieve the goal, say financial success, wouldn't that feel good?
It's a subtle but powerful trap. Let's take pursuing physical attractiveness as a core part of one's identity. Someone really driven by this goal is likely to feel pressured by prevailing cultural standards, right? Which undermines their need for autonomy. They're conforming, not choosing freely. They might constantly compare themselves to others, maybe seeing them as competitors, which frustrates their need for relatedness. And because modern ideals for physical attractiveness are often unrealistically high, they might never feel fully capable of achieving their goal, leading to this chronic frustration of their need for competence. This can create what one researcher, Dittmar, called the cage within, a kind of negative, vicious cycle where failing to meet these extrinsic goals leads to an even stronger pursuit of those same goals, digging the hole deeper.
The cage within. Wow, that's a really vivid phrase. I think most of us can probably relate to feeling a version of that at some point, can't we? Constantly striving for something external, only to feel more empty somehow. What's the way out?
Well, the escape route, according to SDT, is shifting the focus towards intrinsic goals. The empirical evidence is pretty consistent here. Study after study links the pursuit of extrinsic goals with lower psychological well-being, more anxiety, depression, and even poorer interpersonal functioning. Individuals heavily focused on extrinsic goals are, for example, more likely to use friends instrumentally, like to get ahead. They tend to have more conflictual relationships. And some studies even link it to things like racial prejudice or a larger ecological footprint. So the what of your identity goals really does impact not just your own inner state, but also how you relate to others and the wider world.
So bringing this back to elementary education again, how does this intrinsic versus extrinsic focus play out with younger learners? They might not be thinking about careers yet.
Oh, it plays out constantly. Consider a student participating in, say, a school fundraiser. Is their main goal to genuinely help others and contribute to their school community? That would be an intrinsic goal. Or is it primarily about winning the top seller prize and getting that social recognition? That's clearly an extrinsic goal. Now, both motivations might lead to them raising money, right? The immediate task gets done. But the kind of goal fundamentally impacts their long-term well-being, their developing sense of self, and what they learn to value. So as educators, we have this really powerful opportunity to consistently highlight the intrinsic rewards of learning and contribution, the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of helping, the feeling of competence from mastering something new rather than just focusing on the grades, the awards, the external accolades. We can frame activities to emphasize self-development, community impact, personal interest, rather than solely competition or external validation.
Okay, our sources then kind of contrast SDT's perspective with some other popular ideas about how identity forms, and some of these are pretty common in how we think about it day to day. What really stands out to you about these differences, especially when we think about the process of identity formation itself?
Yeah, this is fascinating because SDT really challenges some deeply ingrained beliefs. Take self-esteem. Many scholars see pursuing self-esteem as a primary adaptive motive for identity. You know, the idea that protecting and enhancing self-esteem is universally good. However, SDT argues that actively pursuing self-esteem as a motive tends to lead to that introjected regulation we talked about earlier. It creates internal pressure, conflict, and what they call conditional self-acceptance. You only feel good about yourself if you meet certain external or internal standards. SDT suggests that healthy self-esteem should ideally be an unintended byproduct, something that arises naturally when you pursue authentic interests and values that align with your intrinsic self. It's like Sheldon called it a sidelong approach. Focus on what truly matters to you, and positive self-regard often follows.
So chasing self-esteem directly might actually be counterproductive. That's quite a twist. But it makes a lot of sense when you think about that feeling of conditional self-worth.
It can be, yeah. Another really striking contrast is with some postmodern views on identity. These sometimes suggest that in our complex, fast-changing world, it's actually most adaptive to have a sort of chameleon-like or fragmented identity, shifting who you are depending on the context or demands. Our sources point out this view is pretty inconsistent with the idea of a coherent, integrated identity and with SDT's whole organismic approach. SDT sees this kind of fragmentation as non-optimal functioning. While modern society definitely presents maybe an overwhelming number of choices, SDT argues the self isn't inherently empty. It's an ongoing process, always seeking integration and coherence. A coherent identity where different commitments align is seen as crucial for well-being and navigating life effectively.
That feels intuitively right, doesn't it? Like having a stable inner core that can adapt to different situations rather than constantly changing who you fundamentally are.
Exactly. And then you have various constructivist identity theories. These models focus heavily on how people actively construct, maintain, and revise their identity, often through social feedback and interaction. They tend to emphasize an identity's pragmatic value, how useful it is in helping people meet life's challenges or fit into their social contexts.
Okay, so what are the key distinctions then between SDT's view and these constructivist models? They sound like they might overlap a bit.
They do touch on related processes, but there are three main differences highlighted in the source. First, SDT assumes the existence of that innate self, that inherent growth-oriented tendency we started with. Constructivist models typically don't start there. They often see identity as built more from the ground up, perhaps a more blank slate perspective initially. Second, their criterion for what makes development adaptive is different. For SDT, the benchmark is consistency with basic psychological needs. Is the identity satisfying autonomy, competence, and relatedness? And this is seen as a universal standard. For constructivist models, it's often about pragmatic utility. Does the identity work well in its specific social context? This can be more relativistic. Think about, say, a child complying perfectly with very authoritarian parents. That identity might be pragmatic for avoiding conflict and ensuring safety in that specific context, but from an SDT perspective, it would deeply thwart their need for autonomy, and thus wouldn't be seen as truly adaptive for their long-term well-being.
Wow, that's a powerful example. The child might look well-behaved on the outside, but be internally struggling because a core need isn't met, and SDT says that's not adaptive.
Precisely. And the third key difference is the source of energy for identity formation. SDT is explicit. Basic need satisfaction provides the energy necessary for identity work. It fuels the process. Constructivist models, while often excellent at explaining how identity is built and revised, are generally less clear about the processes that energize identity formation. SDT argues that when your needs are met, you have the psychological vitality to engage in thorough, open-minded identity exploration and construction. When your needs are thwarted, you might resort to shortcuts, leading to less integrated or more defensive identity structures.
So putting it all together, what does this mean for how identity actually forms? Is it purely discovery of that inner self, or is it construction based on experience, or is it something else? It sounds like both might be happening somehow.
It's really described as a combined and interactive role. It's beautiful, actually. The how of identity formation, those construction processes that constructivist models describe so well, will vary depending on the psychological energy available to the self. And that energy comes from those fundamental organismic processes like internalization and especially need satisfaction that SDT emphasizes. There's powerful reciprocity, this feedback loop. Need satisfaction fosters more adaptive identity construction. For example, environments that support autonomy, competence, and relatedness tend to lead to more information-oriented identity styles, where people actively seek out and evaluate information to form their sense of self. And conversely, engaging in adaptive identity construction can also increase need satisfaction. When you actively explore different career paths or personal values in a healthy way, you increase the chances of making choices that genuinely satisfy your basic needs down the line. It's a mutually reinforcing cycle.
So, okay, for our listeners who are maybe heading into elementary school classrooms, what's the really big practical takeaway for them from this complex interplay? How does this translate to working with young kids?
The big takeaway is this. When you intentionally create a classroom environment that genuinely supports autonomy, competence, and relatedness, by giving students meaningful choices, providing those just right challenges that build mastery, and really fostering a strong sense of community and belonging, you are literally fueling your students' ability to engage in healthy identity construction. You're providing them with the psychological energy they need to explore ideas thoroughly, to make commitments that feel genuine to them, and to start integrating these experiences into a strong, coherent sense of self. This is so much more beneficial in the long run than them defaulting to superficial self-beliefs or defensive strategies that often arise when core needs go unmet. You're not just teaching them reading or math, you're actively empowering them to build a resilient, authentic identity foundation.
This has been, wow, a truly illuminating deep dive. It really brings home the idea that our identity isn't just some list of traits or the roles we play. It's profoundly about the why behind our choices, the what of our goals, and fundamentally how well all of that aligns with these innate universal needs we all have for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. It sounds like it's really about cultivating an identity that truly nourishes your inner self, rather than one that just, meets external demands or pressures.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought, especially for those of you thinking about elementary education. As you step into those classrooms, as you guide those young learners, just consider that every interaction you have, every choice you offer, every challenge you present, every single connection you foster, it all has the potential to either deeply satisfy or sometimes inadvertently thwart a child's basic psychological needs.
Hmm.
By consciously focusing on fostering autonomy, competence, and relatedness, you're doing so much more than just shaping their academic journey. You're profoundly influencing the very foundation of their developing identity. You're helping them build a self that is more likely to be truly congruent, deeply satisfying, and resilient long, long after they leave your classroom.